So, like I was saying in the description, first thing that you want to do when you're working with salvaged hardware is you want to make sure that it all works. So, first thing I want to do here, I've already done this, but for your benefit, I'll just do it again, and it's always good to do it under bright lights. Make sure all the CPU pins are straight, which they are, which is great. Next, we're going to check out our CPU, make sure that all of the contact points are also pretty solid, which they are. So, let's not catch those Wi-Fi antenna wires under the CPU lid. Okay, CPU is installed, solid first step. Next step, just because where this is the direction this is going to go, is I'm going to put the RAM in, just because it actually makes the board perhaps a little bit easier to manipulate in certain aspects, and also because once I put the heatsink on, I may not easily be able to put this RAM back in. So one thing to note on this is that a lot of motherboard manufacturers have now gone to these latchless clasps for the RAM. So you'll see on one side here, we've still got the standard lever. On the other side over here, there's no lever. This is very common now. There are even some now, I believe, that are just getting rid of the lever clasp entirely, and you just literally friction seat it. But, careful. Now you don't want to over muscle this. It's fairly straightforward, and you will have to muscle it a little bit, just because there is a certain amount of friction that's keeping it in place, and this isn't, you don't have a great lever. The fulcrum for getting this clasp to close is positioned such that you're going to be fighting it a little bit. But there's the RAM installed. So the next and much more entertaining bit is going to be installing the heatsink. So I'm going to set this aside for just a minute, and we're going to pull this out here. This is our Cryo Rig C1. Nice flat pack of tools. This looks to be the actual heatsink. You can see it's pretty dang beefy. There we go. We don't need that anymore. Don't need that anymore. Alright, so one of the things I like about this particular heatsink is the fact that it's got a very low profile fan, which means that it is not unnecessarily bulky. I find it interesting that they ship it separated. A lot of heatsink manufacturers just ship it direct, but CryoRig does tend to ship their fans separate from their heatsinks. So this is the heatsink right here. You can see it's going to be a top-down unit. It's a decent sized radiator. It's not very thick. It is a low profile. I didn't want to go completely overboard. So I'm going to set that there. That fan there. Let's make sure there's nothing else in the packaging. Alright. Now let's open our tools here. Always be careful when opening your packages. So we've got, that looks to be a shock absorber or insulation of some variety. It's pretty flexible, so it looks to be foam. And that'll be the LGA 775 backplate foam, which we probably don't need, because we're not doing 775. So it looks like, oh, there's the installation guide. So the panel here does have a little bit of a quick guide to kind of show you how things go together, but it's not really an assembly guide, it just kind of shows you these pieces are for this mounting system. So we've got this actually comes with an AMD backplate, which is really nifty. Then we've got an Intel mounting bar We've got a multi-seg backplate. We've got a lot of options here. So we've got our joining screws, we've got our back plate and mounting bar. Got a little guide saying make sure to balance the screws while you put them in. Always a good thing to do because you can put undue stress on things, and you can sink one of the screws down further than it should probably go without putting stress on anything. Now we've got some screw caps here. We've got what looks to be more mounting hardware. It's the AMD back plate and mounting hardware. We will not need that. Now this is kind of nifty. They actually ship a full-size syringe, though by the looks of it, it's only enough thermal paste for one use. Maybe two, if you're a little careful with how much you use. But big frickin' syringe, teeny tiny bit of thermal paste. And I'm sure that was just because the syringes were cheaper. I just find that hilarious. So in case you're interested, this is CryoRig CP7 High Density Cryo Paste. It's thermal paste. Usually, and for our purposes, we're not going to notice much of a difference just in the thermal paste, which thermal paste we use, as long as it's a decent one. So this is mildly interesting. It is a CryoRig labeled Phillips screwdriver with an angle like an Allen key, but the other end doesn't have any screwdriver setting on it, so it's really just a very awkward Phillips head, but it's got a very long shank, which I am guessing is much more necessary on the box mount radiators, where they are very tall, and you have to get to screws that go all the way down. In this case, we probably won't need it. I actually have my own screwdriver set over here. I like it far more than this, but this may be necessary at some point. I haven't put together this particular heatsink before. We got our installation guide, which is always worth having. It also comes with, hold on. So, guide, always worth having. Looks like one is in English and Japanese, and the other is in other languages. So, we've got... Okay, so I forgot that CryoRig does this. CryoRig gives you a product registration card in what looks like a very important sleeve. This looks like a very important component. It is just a fancy way of saying, please register your product. So, I'll set that aside for now. It does come with one alcohol pad. It is great to do this, to take any oils off of your processor, especially if it's a salvage, because a lot of times it may look clean, but it may have some residue on it, may have some oils on it. It will be a detriment to your cooling. So that's very nifty that they include one. I would suspect that this will end up being problematic if you get one that's been on a shelf for a while. These don't last forever, but super nifty that they threw one of those in. So don't need that packaging. We've got more rubber mounts. We've got some long screws. We've got some not quite as long screws. And I'm actually going to hold on to this. This is actually a pretty nifty little organized screw tray. So that will probably come in handy in a bit. All right. Instructions time. Okay, so we are doing LGA 11.5X, so it's just 11, anything in the 1150 series, so 1150, 1151, 1156, 1155, any of those are all the same mount. So we want to do the B mounts on the Intel backplate. Now, interestingly enough, this specifies you to not put the insulating foam on anything except 775. I think that is probably because on the back of most motherboards, the 775 didn't have as much stuff going on back here, and the 1150 series do. And that foam would get in the way, or alternatively, that foam is just to fill in the gap that they left in order for it to work with 1155 or 1150 series mounting points. So they want us, I'm going to set that down here. So one of the things you can do, all right, so we want B, not C. They don't make that easy to select. One of the things you can definitely do in most modern heat sinks is you don't have to put the thermal paste on until the very end, which means you also probably don't have to clean off your processor until you're ready to put the thermal paste on. So I'm actually going to hold off for now because nothing is quite as obnoxious as getting thermal paste on your fingers. It is not the worst thing in the world. It does wash off. It's just frustrating. So one plus that this has is that this is a pre-assembled Intel backplate. A lot of Intel backplates on not quite as nice heat sinks require you to line it up, and then you put the threads, you basically screws onto it or something along those lines. This is already pre-assembled for that, so these screws come up through the mount holes on their own, which is going to make this way easier to assemble. So we've adjusted the back plane, we put it in place. Next we need to put on the screw pillars, which should be, I'm guessing it's these. We've got, those are end caps, so we want the screw pillars. So I'm not going to tighten these all the way down on the first go. First step is just to thread them on. And that's where that warning that came in is you don't want to screw one screw all the way down for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is so that you can balance the tension. One of the other reasons is that oftentimes, especially if you're working with stuff that has not been machined precisely, if you screw one screw down all the way and any of the other screw holes or screws are slightly off kilter, it's gonna be problematic to put that together to line them up, and you'll have to end up going back and unthreading whatever screw. Not a huge deal most of the time because you can usually go back and do that. It's troublesome, it's bothersome, it's time consuming. There will be times in your life when working with screws though that they are one-way screws, that you basically, if you put them in, you don't want to take them out unless you're getting rid of them. So just good habit to be in is you lightly thread until all the screws are in place, then you go back, screw until you start to meet some resistance, and then move on to the next. You just go around. Now it looks, these are not designed to be machine tight, these are designed to be thumb tight, which is why you see they're just ridged thumb screws. So I'm not going to try and over muscle this. Part of the reason is because it's going to be righty-tighty all the way down, and we're going to put more screwed things on top of this, so it'll keep getting tightened down the more stuff we put on. So that's step 2, is the screw pillars. Step 3, they don't organize these directions particularly logically, but okay, so it dumps down here to step 3. I guess. So that's, okay, so yeah. So the flow chart for this is a little weird, but it makes a certain amount of sense because there's a lot of steps that are the same for multiple setups. So next step is we're going to put these mounting bars in place. Now these look to, so these are going to be, they have screw holes in the center. There are 2 screws on the heatsink specifically. And so getting those to line up, we actually want this to sit this way because it will actually arc over the RAM and also provide some additional cooling for the RAM. Now if we do it this way, it actually sticks out a little bit over top of the I/O panel, which in our case and for our purposes, not a big deal, but it can be very frustrating. Now there are other options too. There is an option here where it goes, and actually this may be the option I end up doing just because it doesn't cover some necessary cable points, But one of the problems that I am going to face here is that it does cover some of the pins underneath. Specifically, it's going to cover the 8-pin. It's going to cover, what are these? What pin outs are these? Looks like the 2 USBs, the audio pin out, the chassis fan pin out, and multiple SATA pins, SATA ports. So, while that would make a lot of sense in terms of real estate, if you were doing a very tight build, doing it this way would mean you would have to plug in things like your power cable, things like your SATA cables, all that stuff first, because otherwise you're going to be trying to maneuver cables around stuff and trying to read, oh, is this the pin out I need to connect to? Is it lined up properly? It's going to be frustrating. If we do it this way, there's a lot of overhang. I'm not sure. I'm debating. Now, the overhang this way doesn't cover as much, but it does cover the 24-pin power socket, which is a notoriously stiff cable to work with. And so I think I'm going to have to bite the bullet on this one, and we're going to have to mount it just directly over the board. And I'm just going to have to do my best to work around the limitations. But I have the benefit of knowing exactly where the ports are first. It's one of the great things about learning your board first, looking at your board, finding where all the pins are, so that you'll know when you get to those steps, this is where that is. Alright, so if we're going to mount it this way though, you'll notice the 2 screws are on these sides, so that's where we are going to have to put our crossbars. Now the crossbars are angled in, and it wants us to use the innermost, or I guess the middle, but they're basically the same. And then we're going to do the innermost here. Alright, so we've got our crossbars in place. Then we're going to put in our thumb screw caps, which are here. Once again, loosely threaded. Don't try and tighten them down right off the bat. Just get them on so that the hardware doesn't move around, it doesn't fall off while you manipulate. So, next step is to go around and tighten them all. Getting an angle is tricky. This is one of the reasons why I prefer to work on micro ATX over mini ITX if I don't need to conserve space, because everything is very tight, and so it's very hard to get good angles on things. So that's that done. So now we have our crossbars. And they point out in the instructions that there are 2 orientations. One of the other details, which, I mean, I already figured it out, but you want it to be facing this way up because it's got the screw mount here. They have a diagram saying don't do it the other way is wrong. Alright, so the next thing is to actually put the heatsink in place. Now here comes one of the benefits to doing a modular power supply, because, where did I put that box? There we go. Because I have a modular power supply, I have all my power cables, and none of them are connected to the power supply yet, which means that I can do this. I can preemptively wire the 4-pin CPU power, or the 8-pin, sorry. The 4 plus 4 pin is what this is. Preemptively run that wire, and I'm going to kind of fold that around. So one of the problems is going to be how we're going to route cables, and most of the cables that I'm going to be running are going to be exiting this part, but I'm going to have a graphics card here, and this is kind of a tight alley, so I don't want to run unnecessary cables here. So what I'm actually going to do, it's a little weird, I'm actually going to run this across the board, like so, because the heatsink's not going to sit right on top of the RAM, so I've got a little bit of wiggle room here to work with, and I'm not going to need the USB 3.0 front panel connector because I don't have a front panel for this, at least not a formal front panel. I'm going to be making one, and it's not going to have USB connectors. So we will leave that there, and now we're going to clean off our chip surface. Got a little alcohol pad here. So we're just going to get that a little bit wet, get that wiped off. So, pro tip, don't do this when you have paper cuts on your fingers or anything like that, or scratches, because alcohol stings. Now, fortunately, I have not done that, but I have done that in the past where I've just said, oh, I'm just going to go clean this off, and forgotten that I had injured myself or scratched my fingers, and that hurts. Good for cleaning, though. So, you can kind of aid the evaporation. Not sure how to feel about that. That didn't really get it particularly clean. It's got a little bit of a... There we go. Let's wipe this off. I just want to get any lint, any oils. There we go. So you don't want to leave droplets of alcohol around because it will bead up and then you'll get an imperfect clean. So that's the alcohol swab done. So next step is we're going to put a dab of thermal paste on. Now I like this because it's got the screw-on cap. These caps tend to fall off. I just wish it had more thermal paste in it. So all you want is a pea-sized amount. It's probably honestly maybe a little more than I actually need, but it's fine to err on the side of caution a little bit. I'm going to try and catch that. Alright, thermal paste is done. This is a somewhat tricky bit because now you have to work with the knowledge that you can't touch that at all until the heatsink is mounted. And here lies the wisdom in their packaging system and why the fan doesn't come attached to their radiator. It's because they've done something I really respect. Having worked with inexpensive heatsinks in the past, a lot of times they will put the screws that you need to access under the fins, but they won't give you access to them. So CryoRig has access to the screws, very easy access, which is super handy. Alright, warning, please peel this label off before you use. Please do. I have seen people install heatsinks with the protective plastic in place and then try and use their computers and wonder why their processors fry. It does happen. Pay attention, don't leave that on. It's very easy to forget if you're not watching for it. Alright. So, I'm going to very carefully line this up with the screws. Now you don't typically have to get it perfectly lined up when you're dropping it down onto the processor because you're going to want to kind of wiggle it a teeny tiny bit to get the paste spread around. But there. Okay, so we now have it lined up. And this is where having a screwdriver comes in handy. So this exact set, this is one of my favorite screwdriver sets. It has a real quality feel. The screwdriver handle is, I think it's aluminum, but it is all metal. All the parts work together well. One of my pet peeves is a precision screwdriver where the top nut doesn't spin. and this one definitely does that. Alright, so I'm going to just thread enough that I know that it is tightening. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now I think this one may have shifted on me a little bit. There we go. You want to put just a little bit of pressure on until you get the screw threaded. Then you want to stop putting pressure on the radiator because you don't want to bend the fins. Bent fins are a problem. It's why a lot of radiators have a lot of fins, because one bent fin, not a problem. All bent fins, you're not going to cool properly. So do a few turns on each, back and forth, trading off between them. Because once again, you don't want to unbalance the spring tension. There are springs on these screws, it's kind of hard to see. So we don't actually need to tighten it all the way down. The spring tension will do a lot to do that work. But that's about tight enough. So we now have our heatsink attached. Last step is to mount the fan. Now, one thing that's going to come into play here is we want our fan to be lined up with the fan plug. Okay, so these slide on. I'm curious as to the intent and purpose behind, they have alternate rubber feet. I don't know if they're different or if they're just in case you lose any. I don't really make it clear. Those probably are extra, but they also, as an interesting note, so these are the fan screws for the actual fan I'm using, which is a slim profile fan. They do include full-size fan screws, so if you wanted to replace their stock fan with a higher performing fan, you could do that with the hardware they've included. You would not need to go get a special screw. So this is basically just about the perfect lineup for this motherboard. It's perhaps a little bit off because I would have liked to have had something to hold it in place there, but you know, it's not the worst I've ever worked with. All right. These feel, yeah, let me check. So one of the other things that is always a good thing that falls by the wayside a lot is make sure you've got a good fit on your screwdriver head. If you're using the wrong size bit, you can run into problems. Usually you can get away with it, but sometimes you strip the screw. So using the screw, oops, I am missing a foot. I must have knocked it off and I wonder if it dropped it. That's a good thing I have extra. Did I? I don't see it. But once again, that's why I have extra feet. Come on. All right, so now line up the screws. Once again, we don't tighten them, we just line them up. This is where that really comes into play. If you try and tighten down your screws but you don't have them all lined up, you run into problems. Or apparently you run into problems because the fan cable is in the way of the screw you need to thread. There we go. So we don't want to thread it super tight, we just want to thread it enough that it's not going to vibrate on us. So hand tight is fine. You also don't want to strip the screw or skip a thread, especially with these machine screws. So just hand tight is fine. Just make sure that you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. The less the fan frame can move around, the less vibration noise you're going to get, and the less vibration damage you're going to get, because it will wear out components if it vibrates. Similar rule of thumb with like car engines and stuff. You don't want vibration because vibration can wear things out. So that is the core of our computer build. That wasn't too bad, was it? So I'm going to lose all of these extra bits and pieces. And lose some of that. All right. So one of the things I'm going to do before I move on is I'm going to hook up my power switches. So this is my little one, so this is going to be my reset switch, which, okay, so they want, so I'm going to make my power switch is going to, or my reset switch is going to be my hard drive LED, which is a very common way to do it. And reset switch doesn't really matter the orientation. That's my reset switch. Now the power switch and the power LED. So red is positive, black is negative. So a lot of times you'll get in a situation like this where the cables for your front panel are not labeled. It happens less often now because case manufacturers have clued into it sucks to not know which orientation. They also have seemed to start picking up bidirectional LEDs or some such arrangement, because there are a lot of cases I've seen that it doesn't seem to matter which orientation you plug anything into, it just always works. So power, reset, awesome to have. We will now slide this over to the far corner, go to our next process. So the next step is we're going to do this job. I'm going to show you how I did this with my other 770. So one of the upshots to the GTX 770 was that it was one of the earlier, these are the MSI ones, the twin Frozer style, and they started to implement a heat spreader, which meant that you had more surface area to cool, because the actual work of the air moving across the main board did actually serve to cool, because the radiator fins, the big heat sinks you see, all they do is cool the GPU itself. They don't cool all this other stuff because they don't have any contact with anything else. So you're really just cooling everything else off of the air that's moving past from the fans. So I think that there are, like, the reference cards, the ones that have the fans on the end and blow down, probably do this a little differently, and probably do actually have some contact on some other places in the board, because the airflow is different. But most graphics cards these days take the twin Frozer's approach of having fans that blow down on top of the card, and the fins aren't actually attached to anything except the GPU processing unit itself. So what you're seeing me do is I'm actually pulling little heat sinks off of this. This was sort of a compensation because when I bought these cards, I was going to do a liquid cooling build, but these particular cards didn't have a full card water block. I thought they did. I bought a water block that claimed to fit. It did not fit. Things like that happen sometimes. So I got a universal water block, which does just the GPU itself, and I had to do some custom machining. You'll see some like cut marks. I did try and do my best to like finish it so it looked nice, but I did take a Dremel to it because I had to take a cross piece off to fit the heatsink on. But it did leave me with a graphics card that had a lot of cooling right here and not even airflow across the card. So I shelled out for a heatsink set that I could affix to the heat spreader, which was my major benefit here, because I could just plop these on the heat spreader, and the heat spreader became a heatsink. Now it's a passive heatsink, it didn't have a fan, but it did just enough to keep the rest of the card cool that I could actually clock the card up some and get some benefit out of the liquid cooling. But that's not as important right now. Right now, we are switching back to air cooling and relearning the lesson that I learned previously, which is keep your heat sinks when you switch to liquid cooling, because they're custom. The heat sinks that you buy that come with the cards are designed for the cards. They're designed to work with the cards, and the aftermarket heat sinks that I got here are nice, but they're not going to be as good. They're not going to be tuned to the card. So the trick here is I am trying to find the hex driver that fits these screws. There we go. Hex head. So always be careful when removing a heatsink, because first of all, you don't know if you've unscrewed all the screws properly, like that just happened. And also because there is sometimes the problem that you're running into is that either the thermal paste has dried to the chip and you're damaging the chip by yanking on it, and so then you need to switch to a twisting type motion typically to break the seal, the adhesion. Or there's something else going on, and maybe you haven't fully disassembled things. Maybe there's some aspect or some part that you don't know about that is interfering with your removal of the heatsink. So I'm going to reuse this alcohol pad because it didn't actually see a lot of use on the CPU. Just kind of took the oils off. It didn't actually clean anything off. So I've got a mostly clean alcohol pad here. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that. Try and get some of the old thermal paste. Now this thermal paste is still probably good, to be honest. It was high quality thermal paste, and it's still very fluid. It still, seems to be working properly. So it's a little dark, which tells me that it might be a little scorched, which isn't surprising considering how long this thermal paste has been on this card. I haven't redone the thermal paste recently, so I'm not surprised. I'm not concerned. I do still want to get as much off as I can. Alright. So I've got a microfiber cloth. I'm going to try and tape to this because it's not. There we go. All right. So it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but unless you really care, it's not, strictly speaking, necessary to remove all the extraneous thermal paste. So you really only care about that surface there, because that's the only thing that's going to be touching the actual heatsink. So now, with that complete, I'm going to move that out of the way, and we're going to unbox our main heatsink here. So, they actually have, I like their packaging because it's tight, it's pretty closed, but it's not, it doesn't need scissors to open, with a lot of these. They're actually latched, which is nifty, and then taped. But I cut the tape on one side. So, here's our heatsink. So one of the things you'll notice is it actually has two fan connectors. And this is one aspect that I wasn't particularly clear on whether I was going to need to deal with. because my graphics card only has one fan header, which is actually this 4-pin header, and it has a 3-pin header. And so, to my mind, that tells me that it's just saying, hey, if you have a 3-pin, use the 3-pin. If it's a 4-pin, use the 4-pin. But it is ostensibly meaning that you need both the 4 and the 3-pin, and there is an adapter that would theoretically work. But I'm guessing I don't need this. I didn't do that on this one, but I haven't tested this out since I did the swap. So we're going to set that aside. So it does have an adapter. If you don't have the pinout that is necessary, you can just plug in a Molex to it, and it will power it, and your fans will spin. So this does come pre-configured with some thermal paste. It's probably decent thermal paste. I don't think it would, I mean, Arctic is pretty reputable. I don't imagine they would put bullshit thermal paste on their heat sinks. So we're going to set that there. So one of the things that you get is a whole bunch more of those little heatsink things that I showed you that I've taken myself taking them off. These are aluminum. They actually have some thermal adhesive in the box here. So if I wanted to, I could go back through on my spreader and put more heat sinks back on, but I don't see the need at this point because it actually does have a heat spreader. I think these are mostly for those cases where you don't have a heat spreader or you're really obsessed with getting things cool and you're finding out that it's not cooling properly. So I'm going to leave those off. Itty bitty bag full of hardware. Here's that thermal adhesive pads that I was talking about. Not strictly necessary, but if you wanted to attach some thermal pads, you could. It does have an extra PCI slot. I'm going to take it out. It's hard to take out. It does have an extra PCI slot blank that has very wide vanes on it, so that if you've got a chassis that's got absolutely filled in PCI slot covers, it actually wants to breathe a little bit more. It basically gives you more exhaust options. It does also include some thermal paste, which I think this is supposed to be the thermal glue, so if you wanted to attach these, this is designed to dry out and stick. So I would not use it unless I absolutely had to, or if I was doing the heat sinks. So I'm just going to take this little tray out and set it aside, because I don't need any of that right now. So down here, we've got some software. Programmed according to preferences of GPU temperature. Oh, so this is just talking about optimal fan curves, which is actually really nifty to have. So they actually have custom fan profiles. So if you do custom tune your fans, the stock software is designed to work with the stock fans on the graphics cards. So these are the fan curves they recommend. I'm not going to care about that because I do all my own custom work. Okay. So these, I think these are insulation strips. Some long strips, clear plastic. I think I needed those before as well. Okay, so here's the sticker that has the QR code to get the manual, which is nifty. But it does actually come with a manual as well, a paper manual, which is also handy. It's the QR code with the manual is a sticker, which I thought was kind of a nice touch. So you could theoretically, if you do a lot of these, you could affix the sticker to like your desk or something, and you'd always have it handy. Or you could stick the sticker in like your motherboard manual or what have you. So they have preparation, a whole bunch of stuff on what all the crap is. So yeah, that's insulation tape. So they say, please ensure your fan connector pin assignment on your VGA board is in accordance with the following table. That's fine. If your power socket does not come with 4 pins, please refer to the usage of 4-pin fan power adapter in their special little thing. 2 is to remove all the hardware. 3 is not cleaning circuit components thoroughly with an eraser leads to no adhesiveness of the thermal adhesive at all. We're not using the thermal adhesive, we have a heat spreader. So this is very clearly for if you just have the chips sitting there, they need a little extra oomph. The heat spreader actually does that for me. They actually say to put insulation tape down on the exposed chips around on the circuit components in order to prevent short circuit caused by RAM and VR heatsink interference. So basically, under here, under the edge, which is already covered by a heat spreader, so I don't need the insulation tape. Okay, so we're going to skip to step 5. Choose the correct mounting holes, size, and spacers. So, we're doing it on a GTX 770. So we want the D spacers and the number 3 socket. So if we're looking here, the number 3 socket is this socket here. So in the picture, it just looks like, oh, it's the outermost socket, it's the furthest away from the center. It's a little trickier to see here on the actual thing, the angle's different, but it is this hole. So I'll keep that handy because I'll probably forget. And then they want, for the 770, they want D spacers. And the D spacers are the 2.5 millimeter spacers. So let me do a thing first. Let me empty this box. So we've got a whole bunch of little itty bitty teeny tiny hardware here. And we have 2 sets of clear spacers, or translucent spacers. And one set is tall and one set is short. And so what they're saying is we want these clear short spacers. So I'm going to set those aside. And the screws, and then we've got adhesive and all sorts of fun stuff. All right. So, step 6, we want the adhesive tapes. So we've got 2 sets of adhesive tapes. You'll see they have the 3M logo. It's kind of hard to see. We've got 2 sets of adhesive tapes, and we've got some plastic washers. All right, so they say peel off the top part, put the spacer on, peel it off. It's now an adhesive spacer, which is nifty. They actually say to take this plate off entirely. A little confused by why they want me taking that off, because I'm going to then have to take it off again to put it onto the plate. Oh, okay, so they want you to do that so you can line up the heat sinks with the bracket so you don't have any clearance problems. We're not doing that, so we don't need to worry about clearance problems. We just need to worry about putting things together right. So, let's do the stickers. Okay, so that actually just peeled the adhesive off, not the backing. This is very thin adhesive, apparently. I'm gonna get my super thin flathead here to try and help me out. They actually recommend a craft knife. I don't have one handy at the precise moment. Oh, that's not taking the backing off, that's just peeling. So this part is a little finicky. Try and get starting to give a little bit. There we go. Come on. Come on. We're almost there. There we go. Okay, adhesive is off. Now the next step is still kind of tricky. I'm going to thread this that way. And put that down. So, that is one downside to this particular setup. The adhesive backers they use are kind of finicky to figure out. And that's part of why they want you to peel the backs off, not the whole sticker, which is trickier than they make it seem. I think that's why they give you 2 sets, but let's stick that. All right, let me see if I can get. I might get lucky. What's in here? Ah! I spoke too soon. Aha! And then all right. Never underestimate the usefulness of a knife. Oh, come on. Alright, so they say to peel the backing off the sticker pack, then affix the washer to the sticker, and then peel that off the back, the sticker pack. It does not seem to want to work that way, so I'm going to work the way that I know I can get it. There we go. Not the most intuitive system, but it works. The one thing I do like about the system, though, is that you don't have to try and fit washers onto a screw while trying to get the screw into a hole. You just get the washers stuck on and then worry about the rest later. Now, I will say, doing this process, I highly recommend doing what I'm doing, which is actually threading something through the screw hole to make sure that the adhesive pad is not covering up the hole. Because if the adhesive pads aren't very thick, but it'll be a better time if you do that. Keep splitting the paper. There we go. Shoop. Do-whoop. There we go. Okay, washers are fixed. We're not going to take it apart because we're not going to mess around with the other stuff. So they say plug in the fan and then do the mount. So the mount side, they want us to do the screws. Okay. So, one thing I am apparently missing, or maybe I just put it somewhere and didn't pay attention. I think it's in... No. Maybe I cast it aside. I don't know. There was a foam block. It's supposed to be the shock absorber for the back plate. I don't see it, so I'm not heartbroken over it. But there is a mild problem in that. Let me just double check. Yeah, no, I used it on this one, so I need it. So it's just a flat silver backplate, and there's circuitry and stuff on here, and we really don't want to short circuit anything. So I'm gonna need to either find the foam that I lost or misplaced, or find something else to use. I can see where it came from, which was right here. Ironically, so yeah, so I think they have some packaging problems, but fortunately, with my heatsink for my CPU, they included a little foam ring that just so happens to be the, oh, it's rubber, it's not foam. Okay, but it's adhesive. And so I can square that off on the circuit board here to protect things from getting shorted out. Let me set that like this. And then it wants me to put the black washers. Okay, so that's why there's a second pack. Then I've got these black washers here that are going to do the same job as the clear ones. So bear with me while I do the exact same thing 4 more times. So I think these adhesives are not nearly as important because you could just thread them on to the screwdriver, or to the screw, and it would just work. But we're doing this by the book. Alright, washers are in place. Now these washers do actually have a benefit, which is that they're not, I mean, it keeps the back plate from pressing down on the back of the card, which is nice. Alright, so they're saying, I guess it doesn't really matter which way I do it. One side's got a plastic coating on it, so I think, oh yeah, so that's plastic insulation. That side's going to go down. And then, yeah, that goes on, and then we have the 4 specialty screws. So this part is a teeny bit tricky to pull off. Alright. So I have the benefit of my fan port being at the very edge of the card, so I don't have to worry about it at this point. I don't know what these were for. Adhesive. Screw it down. Oh, okay. Maybe. No, never mind. I think those were just for a different setup. Alright. Okay. So now I need my finer point screwdriver. So this is yet another perfect example of don't thread anything 100% because you need it to have that wiggle. Just do enough to make sure that everything's lined up. Then do it to the point that you just start to get some tension. Now, some of the old knowledge of how to set up computers is that you should tighten alternating screws in an X formation. So basically you do this one, that one, this one, that one. That you should be tightening opposing screws in sequence. Once again, we're not doing it super tight. We've got these washers that are designed to take a little bit of the tension and cushion it. So just hand tight and just to the point that they don't want to turn easily. There we go. So that's mounted. So then the last thing we do is we're going to... Now I highly recommend you do this step first on most motherboard or most graphics cards. So a lot of times that fan is not easy to get to. Now the other thing you want to do is cable manage. You don't want that wire getting loose and touching your fan vanes or anything, getting in the way. There we go. That is another graphics card all set up and ready to go. So I'm actually going to set these aside as well. Clear some space. And we don't need those instructions anymore. I'm going to set that aside. Let's dump the garbage back into the box. Shoot the dude. Naturally. Close the box, and all set. Okay. So, we now have the graphics card, core motherboard. So then next, we're going to start lining up the power supply. So one of the things I have done is I have pre-run a power cord. And then I've run an HDMI cable over to one of my main monitors, which won't feature here. So we have our power supply. Now we start lining up cables. One of the other tricks that you'll run into when it comes to doing custom builds like this is that, or doing bench tests like this, is that the graphics cards actually need a little bit of clearance on one side, because otherwise they the vanes that are designed to lock into the PCI slots and give it more support need to stick down further than the motherboard supports. So typically holding it off the edge of a desk can be helpful, but more safe is simply have something non-conductive it can rest on that's elevated. So we will get to that later. Just a note, I'm going to go grab my little bit of elevation here. Sorry about that, a little bit of a delay, but I couldn't find my bit of elevation, so I'm going to make do. That should be enough. So I wanted to grab a SATA cable because I'm going to need that. And we're going to start putting things together here. All right. So one SATA cable is all we need. We're going to pre-run that. We're going to run that right here. Plug that in. That should be all set. Give it a little bit of working. There we go. All right. Also going to want our 24+4 pin, which is a tiny bit confusing because it doesn't seem to label. I'm guessing this is the 24 port side that I want. That fits. Okay, so that's weird. So one side has a wider, so you'll see on this side there's a little tiny clip. The other end has a wider clip. This side is the side that goes into the power supply because it only fits the smaller clip. That's a weird way to make sure that you're using the right end of the cable. The problem is that then I've got this extra 4-pin. Got a sense 4-pin. That's a full 24 pins. What the fuck is? What is this for then? Alright, bear with me a minute here, guys, because that doesn't make a lick of sense. And it doesn't seem to come with the manual either. So on the back of the box. Just has a picture of the pin. Alright, bear with me for a minute. I need to do a little bit of research here. So that's the SX650. G. Here we go. Any ATX harness done about as well as I've seen any ATX ribbon cable harness done. 2 big ribbons with an extra for V-Sense. Okay, so that is for the V-Sense. The heck is V-Sense? Okay. So that is a feature I didn't know it had. It's a little weird. So, for future reference, if you buy the SX650G, and you wonder what the extra little 4-pin cable is, I guess that's for voltage sensing. I guess there's some software that this works with, or some internal system that regulates the voltage better. I don't know. But that's the 24-pin handled, and then you've got 2 EPS 8 pins. I only need the 1. There we go. Alright, so that's my main board plugged in. One other thing I want to make sure is that it's switched off, because this can get messy. Alright, then we've got our SATA drive. And we're going to need SATA power. And we only need the one SATA power plug, but unfortunately, it doesn't give me a lot of options. Oh, they just group together. Okay, yeah, no, it's the same thing. It's 2 3-pin, or 3 socket. Alright. So I may invest in a SATA to Molex adapter or vice versa, so that I only have to run one rail for my hard drive and my accessories. I don't have a bunch of extra cables that I don't need. Alright, next we're going to need twin 8-pin power, which we should be able to accomplish off a single rail. We're going to this in first. I'm going to slide these power connectors around a little bit here. These power switches. There. And we're going to plug in our GTX 770. Move that to the edge there. I'm going to bend those a little bit more out of the way. very carefully seat the graphics card. We're actually going to shift this a little bit more this way and put something under it to support it because it wants to bend. Actually, this should serve just about perfectly, ironically. There, we'll do it that way. There we go, nice and stable. All right, and then we plug the HDMI in. And fetch the spare keyboard that I keep tucked over in the corner. I'm going to plug it into one of the main USB ports, one of the primary USB ports. There we go. Switch it on from the power supply. Ooh, that is a very satisfying click on the resistive switches. All the fans are spinning on the graphics card. So I missed a step. I'm very embarrassed. Please no one judge me. I got a little ahead of myself. I forgot to plug in the power connectors. So now normally in a chassis, or if you had a proper test bench, you would be doing this part and it would have much more support for the graphics card. I do not own a proper official test bench. So I am forced to work with what I've got. So if you're going to do it the way I'm doing it, make sure you are supporting the other side of the graphics card while you are pressing the power connectors in, because they can be argumentative, and the last thing you want to do is damage your components while you're testing. All right. Take two. So I'm going to go off camera a bit here for a bit, because I need to keep an eye on my monitor. Still not getting anything. Let's make sure. That it's seated properly. Bring it back to this point because we want as much support under the graphics card socket as possible. Alright, I'm gonna do it this way. There we go. Okay. Let's try this again. There we go. Alright. And no boot device selected, which is what I expect from a blank SSD. So, I get to create a Windows installation disk. And the important thing is that it is actually working, which tells me that all of these components do work to a certain degree, which is always good to know. But I'd like to know that they work well together. Now, I think this was probably set up as a Windows installation key. So pro tip, on older motherboards, and especially for Windows 7 installations, if you're doing a Windows 7 installation, don't plug a USB 3.0 drive into a USB 3.0 port. As a matter of fact, try not to plug anything into the USB 3.0 ports, because Windows 7 does not natively support 3.0, whereas Windows 8 and 10 with their UEFI setup do support Windows USB 3.0 ports natively, at least from the context of you're going to run the installer, so you need these to pick up your USB drives. So it looks like I did set this up for a Windows 7 installation, which is fine. Let me We're just doing this as a test to make sure that everything functions together and we don't have any DOA components. There we go. Now, one of the things that I absolutely love about modern computers is they are so freaking fast to set up. So it copied the Windows files in 2 seconds, which was nice. So now it's got to actually do all the processing. This part's going to be very boring, so I think this is where I'm going to end the stream for tonight. It's also almost 10 o'clock. I'd rather get off and not drag on. So we've gotten to the point where the system is running. All the hardware does work together, which is super nifty. It's a little kludgy looking right now, but that's to be expected because I'm just doing a basic bench test. One thing I am curious about, yep, the reset switch is actually flashing as the hard drive is being accessed, so that's good. Everything is working as I expected it to. So once this is done, I'm going to do all this besides behind the scenes. I'm not going to stream this part of the process, but once I'm done with this step and make sure that everything works well together, then next time we're going to start getting to actually build things with Lego pieces. So I think next we're going to start with the motherboard mount, which is probably the easiest part, and then we're going to look at mounting the hard drive, and then looking at ways we can reinforce the graphics card mount to better support the graphics card with Lego. Alternatively, we do actually have a PCIe extension cable. It was from my main rig, because when I purchased my main rig, the Thermaltake extension cable did not work with the 1080 Ti, which I had purchased. I had to buy a premium cable for that to work, but I do still have the original cable, which should still work with this, and if it doesn't, then I get to RMA it with Thermaltake. They'll send me a premium cable for free, still have an extra premium cable, and that gives us some freedom to move that graphics card around and support it by other means, and not have it directly mounted to the board, which gives us a lot more options. So that's it for tonight. Please like, share, and subscribe. This is where everything's going to be showing up. So you know, if you want to hang out with me, I do keep the chat active. So if you want to say hi and hello, I'll definitely respond. There's a bit of a delay, so I will probably see your response much after I do a thing. So it'll happen. So anyway, that's it for me for tonight. So I'm signing off, and I will see you guys all next time.